One of the biggest changes in Octane 3.08 for Maya with regards to geometry and working with geometry in a scene is that you no longer have to specify a geometry type. So in previous versions of Octane for Maya, you would have to set the geometry type in the Shape tab for the surface. And you could choose between global, scatter, movable proxy, or reshapeable proxy, depending on whether the object was static, whether it was a particle instance, whether it was just having its translation animated, or whether it was going to be animated using a deformer such as joints or a nonlinear deformer like a bend deformer or something like that. Well, you no longer need to do that. If you select a piece of geometry and go into the attribute editor, it's actually selected here. Under the Octane tab, you'll find a number of settings for the geometry, but you'll no longer find a mesh geometry type setting. Instead, you'll find animator data, and Octane is usually very good at detecting what's going on with the animation for the geometry in the scene. So you can usually set this to automatic, and things should animate just fine when you view the render. However, there is an occasion where sometimes it does not, something goes wrong and it doesn't actually animate correctly. In those cases, you can find the piece of geometry that is causing the problem and set it to force load. But you only need to do this if you really have an issue with the geometry. Otherwise, you should be just fine. The other settings that you'll find here in the Octane tab relate to whether it's going to have the lighting baked into it, which is covered in another video, its visibility to the rendering camera, smoothing angles, and so on. We also have a setting for open subdivision level so that you can subdivide the surface at render time, which means that you can use low polygon geometry, and if you've modeled it correctly, in other words, you have nice clean topology with edge loops, subdividing it should make it very easy to work with low polygon geometry and have it look nice and smooth when you render it. If I switch to, say, viewport 2.0 and selected an object, say the base of the robot here, if I press the 3 key to get a preview of what the smooth mesh preview looks like, you'll get an idea of what it's going to look like when you render if you increase the open subdiv levels. And you can actually choose open subd scheme using this menu down here. Usually Catmull Clark is the preferred method, and that is also similar to what I'm using here in viewport 2.0. Of course, if I have open subdivision level set to 0 and I press the 3 key, that is not going to affect how it looks in the Octane render. In other words, if I deselect this, this is what it looks like at the lowest subdivision level, even though I have the 3 key applied, the smooth mesh preview, that I should say. So let's press the 1 key here and instead increase the open subdiv level, and you can see that it will smooth it each time I raise that. You want to use this with caution. Don't go too high too quickly, because that will add to render time. If you're going to be displacing a surface, it's usually a good idea, rather than displacing a surface that has absolutely no detail, like a flat plane, and turning it into a mountain. It is possible to do that with Octane. However, that will increase render time. It's usually a good idea to have the low polygon geometry resemble the overall shape of the displaced geometry. That'll help ensure that you have a nice, efficient render. So those are some tips on working with geometry when rendering with Octane for Maya.